Hey, Cut the Shit listeners. You can find every episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Go check us out. Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Cut the Shit, a podcast series that aims to take a closer look at the impact of the IT industry, both the good and the bad. Cut the Shit is brought to you by Plow Networks, a managed IT services company based just outside Nashville, Tennessee. I'm Bryan Link, COO here at Plow, and I'll be your host for this series. I'll ask questions, and with the help of our guests, try to dig deep on some of the key challenges we all face dealing with IT. So with that, let's cut the shit and get started. On today's episode, I'm very excited to have Dave Burrill as our guest. Dave is the founder and managing director of a consulting firm called Bridging Business and IT, and his passion is making the installation and delivery of IT projects more successful. To say Dave has deep expertise when it comes to helping businesses complete IT projects would be an understatement. Since getting his start in public accounting in the 80s, Dave has spent almost 40 years working to help bridge the gap between business and IT across a broad range of industries and company sizes. As you will hear during our conversation, Dave has learned a lot over the course of his career, and he sees it as his calling to help businesses improve the miserably high failure rate of IT projects. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dave Burrill. Dave, welcome to Cut the Shit. How are you today?
Good, Bryan. Thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you. First time we don't have a previous relationship, so I'm excited to learn more about what kind of your background and sort of what you're up to today. But before we kind of dive into the meat of the discussion, I always like to ask guests just to kind of get us started off. Can you give us an example of a technology that you've seen or heard, or maybe a hack that you've even used on your own lately that you think is interesting enough that you could tell us about it?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I think the single biggest hack that I would say is something that just came out in a book by Ben Flyvbjerg. Have you ever heard that name?
Ben Flyvbjerg?
Ben Flyvbjerg.
No.
Danish name. The guy's an Oxford professor. He's the world's foremost leading expert on large projects. And IT projects just happen to be one thing that he does. He's done a lot of work with McKinsey and Company. And his hack is the most basic, most obvious thing in the world that anybody that has ever built anything physically knows to a T, right? You figure out what you're going to do before you try and build it. Damnedest concept.
Right.
His idea is that planning for any IT project is not filling out a series of forms. It's not completing a schedule. It's not coming up with a risk register. It's prototyping the solution that you want to build before you try and build it. Everybody's mind's eye is different, and a picture's worth about 1 million words. So if you can actually put together two simple things, a process map and a storyboard that says, this is what we want to build, and this is how it has to flow. It doesn't take that much time to do it. It's really cheap to iterate versus, doing it later. Because if you take the time to do a storyboard up front, a process map, you're going to answer all the main questions that you need for the project. And what people don't think about is, oh my God, that's too much work. I don't want to do it. But you're going to do all that work anyhow.
Right.
By the end of the project, you will have answered all of those questions. It just happens to be a whole lot cheaper and a whole lot less painful to answer those things on paper before kind of win or lose on paper before you have to win or lose in real life.
Right.
So, that's my high-tech hack.
High tech, low tech, my favorite kind, right? Pencil and paper, Sharpie and a thick piece of paper. One of those. I got a background in product management, and we used to always take that sort of thick art paper and Sharpies, and that's how we'd do our screen mock-ups. And the reason you did that and used the thick ones on purpose, right, so that you didn't try to get too fine-tuned with it, and try to get the big pieces of the UI nailed down and kind of what the functions were supposed to be. I think this is kind of in line with what you're talking about.
It's exactly in line with what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, that's a good lead in, given what I know about your background. So why don't you, to kind of help get us started, give us a thumbnail sketch on your background and kind of how you got to where you are today, and then maybe lead that into the sort of the origin story of the operation you've got going today.
Well, there was a question that got me to where I am today, and that was simply, how can so many smart people make such incredibly stupid mistakes? Right? In terms of how I got here, It's a Grateful Dead song. What a long, strange trip it's been. I started off life thinking I wanted to be an academic. I was working on a PhD in organization and systems design. Got all the coursework out of the way and realized I needed another 5 years of abject poverty to write a dissertation. Also, by that point, put together that abject poverty sucked, so decided to leave. A really lucky break was the guy that was my chairman became the first chief learning officer in the world for Jack Welch at GE. This guy's name was Steve Kerr, and after Jack Welch left GE, he went over and worked as the chief learning officer for Hank Paulson at Goldman Sachs, before Paulson went over and became Secretary of Treasury and oversaw the great financial crisis. So it was this guy's recommendation to me. He said, at that point, I wanted to be what was known as a VP of IT. CIOs hadn't really been coined as a term yet.
Right.
So his suggestion was go to some place like the big eight, big consulting houses, become an auditor, become a CPA. He said, because there's no better way than to understand the processes and the ins and outs of a business than auditing. So interviewed with a couple of places. Pricewaterhouse would allow me to get certified first and then jump to consulting, which is what I did. But my last year there, my wife got pregnant and I was working 100 hours. I was billing 100 hours a week and traveling nonstop. So you can imagine how that story went up.
Yeah.
A few weeks before the baby was born, I got the ultimatum. It's me or the job.
Yeah.
Went to the first of 3 high-tech startups. The first one was at First Revenue when I joined them. I left them 4 years and 4 months later at $275 million, had taken them public. Most of the growth was organic, but there were some acquisitions. So did the IPO, follow-on offerings, did about a dozen M&A projects there, did all the system implementation, left them, joined a consulting group, just doing large analytics and business intelligence applications. Last big job was the merger of MetLife and Travelers when they carved together their healthcare businesses in 94, 95. And then we were working with the senior leadership of Deloitte and Touche's IT consulting practice globally. And the guy had taken us aside, my partner, and he said, you guys have really got some interesting software. You got to turn it into a company. So we did, went out, raised a couple million in angel funding, and eventually raised 2 more rounds after that. Got a pretty good following, had Gardner kind of raving over us, which was terrific at the time. But we sold that to another publicly traded company in 2003. Stayed during the lockup period, as you always have to
as
wait
you have
for
to.
the golden
That's
handcuff
right.
checks to clear the bank. Left 15 minutes after that. And I wish I could say that's an exaggeration, but it's not. I had been, I'd always flown American up until this acquisition. So I had all my miles on American, but this company was hubbed in Denver. So everybody got flipped over to United.
Right.
I made 1K status on United in the first 90 days. 100 flights in 90 days. So that was that life.
Yeah.
Which wasn't a life.
Right. I was going to say that's something. I don't know what you call that.
Yeah, it wasn't living. Left there, consulted for a while, did some work for Microsoft on the Dynamics suite, and then joined another startup at First Revenue, sold that to Western Digital a couple years later. Did another roll-up for Blackstone Private Equity as a CIO. Then kind of acted as an entrepreneur in residence for a venture fund down in San Diego, doing nothing but SaaS software. Then had to take a couple of years off to deal with a dying parent and mopping up an estate, and then came back out. And the idea of retirement was abhorrent. I'd be suicidal if I didn't. I think either I would be suicidal or my wife would shoot me. I'm not sure.
Right, the result's the same, right?
I'm still dead, but it's one of the two.
Right.
It's clearly what's going to happen in fairly short order. So I had to find something to do, and I always had over the years. When you start your career, you're working with relatively low-level people, but as you move up the food chain, you start dealing with the C-suite. And I kept seeing these senior executives who were very bright, very competent people make these incredibly horrific oversights. And the pattern that I started witnessing, that's being too gracious, I'd probably seen this pattern 200 or 300 times before it kind of dawned on me what was going on. But you show me something 200 or 300 times, even I began to detect the pattern, right? So these guys would, the way that this always went was the vendor would be retained to do something that was allegedly very simple, very straightforward, in air quotes, right? They start off trying to do it. Months go by, they can't deliver. The sponsor who retained them in the first place is now convinced that this person is a crook or incompetent or malicious or slimy, whatever you want to call it, right? So the business is enraged at the tech side of the project. As you do some digging, you then realize that the problem isn't the fact that the technologists were out to lunch, it's that the business never told them everything they needed to do.
Right.
They never fully articulated the problem. The technologist never knew which questions they needed to ask the business to find out what was required. And both sides were making assumptions that nobody ever bothered to confirm. We were doing this on autopilot, and we got to the point where you would just wind up with an utter disaster. And I just kept seeing that over and over and over again. And I started researching, why is this happening? And kind of the first step was, are the failure rates really that bad? And all of the literature, to my surprise, was, yes, they are. Yeah. And not so much in hardware projects, but certainly in software endeavors. Right. Hardware tends to be a little bit more tangible action.
But well, the range of possibilities more limited, right? So, you can't. It's harder to create your own adventure when you're talking about the hardware side. I mean,
and it's also been better documented.
Yeah,
which certainly helps. So, these guys had done these things where they were completely out to lunch, and what was happening is about 70% of all enterprise IT software projects fail. And that's pretty good evidence behind that. So Carnegie Mellon's found it, the Consortium for Information and Software Quality's found it, the Standish Group 2020 Chaos Reports coming in around 66, 67%, 68% failures for 20 years. So these numbers are really static. So there's good news and bad news in that. The good news is that there's only 20% of those are smoking craters.
Right. I was going to say the definition of failure. I know it's there's a range.
It's a broad range.
None of it's good, but it's not, to your point, it's not complete crash and burn, but you didn't meet the objective. Right.
Correct. Either you were over budget or you took longer or you didn't deliver what you said you were going to. So about 50% fall into that category. But if the project's over $1 million, the odds of failure jump by about 50%. So the smoking crater rate falls to about 1 in 3. Which, anyway you cut it, that ain't great.
No.
The material level of suboptimal performance is,
high.
Yeah, significantly higher.
Yeah.
And true success looks like about 1 out of 20, which, anyway you skin it, that's not pretty good.
Yeah, even for a baseball guy, that's a bad average.
It's a bad average. You're not staying in the majors very long.
No, that's below the Mendoza line significantly.
You got an issue with that. I mean, and try and put this into more tangible perspective. Can you imagine if a contractor only delivered on time 1 time out of 20? And that 1 out of 3 times was a total disaster? This guy, Ben Flyvbjerg, did a lot of research on this from McKinsey and found that 1 out of 6 of these projects, have you heard this? Go so badly they threaten the very existence of the enterprise?
I hadn't heard that.
1 out of 6. So just to put that into perspective, that's like playing Russian roulette with the life of your business.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that. That's about the frequency of these failures. It looks like as of 2020, this was costing about $1.8 trillion in the US alone every year. And the primary reason for that was research that was done by IEEE. And they found that if you catch a software issue pre-release, it's about 50 times more expensive to fix it because you got to roll everything back and redo it. If you don't catch it until post-release, it's about 100 times more expensive to handle it. So it really pays to figure out what you want to build before you're going to try and build it.
Sure.
Right? So that's how they get to this 1.8 trillion. When I started looking at it, I was thinking that it was the smoking craters that were going to be the most expensive. And I was completely wrong. It was the other way around. Smoking craters are only about 20% of that number. It's the suns that limp into production but never did what they were
Right. I was
supposed
going to
to.
say there's almost something better to shooting it in the head, taking your lumps and moving on, right? Monetarily speaking, right? But that's an ego problem. No one wants to admit failure, right? There's still a business problem, whether it's well defined or not. We know it's not, but there's clearly a problem, or we wouldn't be trying to do this in the first place. We may not know exactly what the problem is, at least in terms of good definitions, but we know something's wrong. That's why we went down this path in the first place, right?
Your point, no one wants to admit failure, is just dead on. I've seen people turn themselves into logical pretzels or human pretzels trying to explain why it wasn't a failure. Well, you spent 15 times what you said you were going to, and at the end you abandoned the project.
Right.
What part of that looks like a success? Oh, well, no,
Yeah.
we managed the project out. No.
That's good company speak for we failed.
Right, yeah, exactly. So it's just like own the reality of the situation,
Yeah, so I want to dig in. So tell me a little bit about what your company. I know you kind of walked us to where you sort of are today, and talk to us a little bit about where you're engaging. I mean, this is a big problem, right? Where do you see yourself and your organization kind of fitting in to the solution side of this?
Well, the research kept going, and what I was finally able to discover is, and I think this is the angle for it, or the angle for the solution. What we have not realized for 5,000 years is that we are not masters of our own mental domains, right? To paraphrase Jerry Seinfeld. We think we know what we're doing. We think we know what we're saying. We think we can control our thoughts and actions, and the reality is we can't. The greatest irony of them all is the very first person that the tech team wants to talk to whenever they go into a project in a business is, I got to talk to the SME. I need to talk to the subject matter expert, right? Because this is the oracle that is going to tell you everything that you need to know.
Right.
So without, spending 2 hours breaking down the mechanics behind this, what we've discovered in the last 20 years is that as you begin to acquire a skill, all of the processing for that takes place in the front of your prefrontal cortex, right behind the top of your forehead, the part of our brain that makes us the most human. Our brains are in many ways a computer. They run on power processing and storage. The ghost in the machine, our operating system, realizes that we're spending a lot of time. Like, I'm a guitar player. I'm a bad guitar player, but when it's therapy.
Right.
And I've been doing it for a long, long time. But when I was first learning to play guitar, I was using up a lot of resources trying to figure out where to put my fingers and how to do that, right? Anybody who's ever played an instrument knows that. Anybody who's ever mastered a baseball swing or a golf swing or a tennis serve, whatever it is, it's the same thing. So what happens is your operating system, your autopilot, realizes that you're investing an awful lot of energy and resources in doing this work manually. It also realizes over time that you seem to be serious about it because you keep doing it. So it's going to try and optimize those scarce resources. And what it does is it transfers the processing of that information from the prefrontal cortex down to the basal ganglia and the cerebella, which are the lowest levels parts of your brainstem. We lay down dedicated circuits on a chip is probably the best way to describe it. That will allow an expert to do something 3,000 times faster than a layman. That's all great. The problem comes because that autopilot goes back and it flushes your RAM cache and it wipes out all the things that you used to remember. So the great irony is the more of an expert you become, the more detail you internalize and the more detail you forget. So the very people that we have been turning to try and figure out what we need to do are the very people that are least physically capable of telling us what we need.
Right. They've turned all that into tacit knowledge. They can't actually explain what they're doing. They don't even remember why they do it. They just do it. Right. It's like it's reflex.
They're on autopilot, quite literally. We joke about it all the time, but we really have an autopilot. So step one for me was appreciating the fact that autopilot exists and helping people appreciate the fact that you got to work around it. I've gone through hundreds of books on neuroscience and cognitive psychology and research papers over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's been very helpful to actually sit down with neuroscientist guys that used to teach at Yale and at Columbia and say, am I all wet on this? Or is that, no, you're dead on. This is exactly what's happening. But what's really interesting with these guys and what they've helped me to appreciate is that, and this is more recent research, all knowledge is stored in our brains like a hologram in our head. It's like a multidimensional mental model. So imagine a hologram that you've got trapped inside your brain. Everything that you know how to do, whether it's processing language or it's setting up a network, is part of that hologram. Thinking is the act of moving around that hologram. Now, the more of an expert that you become, so thinking is movement. They are actually one and the same.
Right.
When we become an expert, the only thing we remember is a summary story of that hologram, a summary story of that mental model, which is limited to about 5, 7, maybe 9 things if we're really good. All the other details have been forgotten. From an evolutionary perspective, that's all that counted. 150 years ago, the toughest thing we had to worry about was hooking Betsy up to the carriage, right? I mean, you go through more steps than that, just configuring the simplest router than anybody ever came up with.
Right.
So the way to get an expert moving is to ask them questions about the process. That was a long way to get to that answer. Sorry for that long-winded cycle, but the problem is you got to get people thinking. You have to force them to think, which means you have to blow them out of their comfort zone. You have to challenge them with the things that they hadn't thought about before. And at first, they will kind of rebel.
Right.
And either ignore your prompts or refuse to admit that they're real. And once you keep digging, once you keep probing, then you can get them to understand that, oh, there's about 20 things here that I forgot to tell you.
Right.
Those 20 things are all pretty critical. So where we're working is twofold. And number one, helping people understand that that's where the problem really lies. And the second piece of it is helping them understand how you unpack the requirements that you've got. And the beauty of this is there's sort of a solution to it that hides in plain sight and people just don't see it. Business execution is continually thought of as being a linear exercise, where you move the ball from point A to point B to generate revenue or control expense or minimize expense. What we forget is it's a cycle. And that cycle is the same in any organization on the planet. The cycle's got 2 halves. You either automate the process or you evaluate the performance one, which coincidentally coincide with the only 2 types of software that are out there. Something else people don't think about. There's only 2 types of software at their fundamental limits. You either automate a process, you report on the performance one. I can't tell you the number of usually MIT professors who say, my God, you're right. I never thought of it like that. But when you break it down into that, you give them that first mental image and say the first half coincides with 2 of the 4 work roles in a business, and the second half coincides with the other 2. I look at you again strangely and say, there's only 4 types of worker in any organization. The frontline workers who do the work, the managers that schedule, coordinate, analyze, or not analyze, but train, supervise those people. The data that comes out of that first half of the cycle is used by analysts to figure out what's going on. They give their reports to the executives who, in theory, refine the process going forward.
Right.
And then the cycle repeats. When you use that as kind of a jig, a mold, a template, a model, right? You can walk around that cycle and ask questions at each of the steps along the way.
Right.
And it's a pretty surefire exercise. This is one advantage. There weren't many, but this is one advantage of having spent 4 years at Price Waterhouse. You'll learn how to audit a process.
Right.
And that's all it is.
Gotcha. So let's dig in a little bit, because I'm sitting here thinking of my listeners who are all, I'm sure, thinking, yeah, I remember a project like that, right? They're having probably maybe PTSD or flashbacks of some sort. Maybe they're not. I hope they're not, but they probably are.
They probably are.
And so, and I don't want to go down the war stories route. I'd rather talk more about maybe archetypal things or role-based things. So when you think about maybe a few recent engagements, and I want to focus on ones that you feel like have been successful or in the process of being successful, because some of these things can take a while, so they might not be finished yet. But when you come into a situation, and maybe give us an example or two, and it's one that's bearing fruit and is successful. what are the roles that you're bringing together in the early stages that maybe differentiate it? The right people are at the table is I guess where I'm going with that, versus where they're not, and what does that look like? Because again, I'm trying to help the listeners, allow you to help the listeners try to avoid making some mistakes, right? That's what this would really be about.
It's twofold. So there's two parts to that answer. The first mistake that we make is assuming that these are IT projects. They are never IT projects.
They're business projects that happen to leverage technology, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we skate right over that. Now, the second that you say we have an IT project, the second you say it, we give permission to the business to abrogate responsibility for providing the only thing that they're capable that they can give. They're the only ones that have the answer to this, and they've immediately checked out and said, I don't need to screw with this. This is an IT deal.
The tech guy's got it. Yeah.
The guy's got it. This is not my deal. It's a tech project.
Right.
Wrong. So the first thing that you need to do is sort of stand your ground and say, look, I'm not clairvoyant. I can't read minds, and there's no such thing as the Vulcan mind meld. So either you tell me what I need to know, or I'm not going to know it, which means this is going to fail, right? So I hate to inconvenience you. I know you have another job. I know you have things to do. I know you were sold this promise by the sales guy that said this was going to solve all your problems. It probably will, but you've got to endure a lot of pain before you get there. And he forgot to mention that.
Right.
As part of the sales pitch, right? Software technology only makes things better after it's implemented. Then it can make things a lot better. But until you get past that, there's some work to be done.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? So that come to Jesus moment has to happen quickly. The second thing that you need to do is engage the executives very quickly, because they are the worst offender of all. And I say that lovingly because I have a lot of these friends, and I can give you a couple of illustrations. I've always refused to name names publicly because I'm not trying to shame anybody, but they're good illustrations of what's going on, right? The executives do two things. One, they buy solidly into this notion that it's a tech project, it's an IT project. Not really real. Nobody's really confronted them and said, no, you're going to have to contribute to this, and this is going to be painful for you, and you're going to have to do it. It's not, and the irony is, it's not that painful. It's just
I think it's a delegation fallacy,
today.
Right? They spend so much time. I mean, a lot of what you do is at the executive level is delegation, right? Thinking about what needs to be done and then matching that with the right person to do it. So it feels like your job is to delegate, because it is. That's a big part of your job. But what you're talking about here are things that can't be delegated, right? There, I mean, and I think it's like, well, to your point, it kind of gives you the permission to say, well, we're delegating that to the tech guys. Like, well, not really.
They're technologists. They don't understand your business. You know, there's a flip side to that, just as a fast sort of caveat. Almost all of us have encountered some usually young, invariably male software engineer that makes the incredibly arrogant and ignorant statement, I know more about what the business needs than they do. And the business has been put off to no ends by those statements. They have been offended, and rightfully so. But all that individual has communicated is he has no idea what questions he need to ask to be able to get at the answers that he requires.
Right.
So let's go back to the idea of getting to the executives first. As you and your listeners may have gleaned by this point, is I don't really have a problem being confrontational, at least occasionally. I try and do so in a humorous fashion. There are some execs, again, when you start your career, you tend not to square off with a CEO. You know, you would prefer to avoid that. I usually get called in when their house is on fire, right? At which point you can speak truth to power fairly easily.
Right. Desperation allows a lot of stuff to fall away, right?
Well, the other advantage is I've done about 35 transactions in total. I've been the president, COO of a software company. I've raised money on Wall Street with private equity and with venture funds. I've raised scores of millions of dollars. I have been where they are. So I'm not just a technologist that doesn't know what this part of the story looks like. I've been there. I've had to respond to analyst calls. It makes a bit of a difference. So a few years back, I got contacted by a mutual friend that asked me to meet with the CEO of the mortgage division of one of the largest banks in the world. They had spent the last year and a half and a couple $1 million trying to put in place a data warehouse solution and reporting solution. They had nothing to show for it. So it turns out that this guy was flying across country, but he happened to live out by me. So we got together one Friday for lunch. And he explained the background a little bit. And I said, okay, let me just ask you some questions. I want to get my brain around what's going on here. And I said, did you guys figure out the business questions you were trying to answer? And he looked at me with the condescending, arrogant stare that can only be mustered by a senior executive that has been around the block multiple times. And very much got the glare. That's without saying it directly. That's
stupid question.
Stupidest question I've ever heard. And he actually did go so far as to say, in my entire career, nobody has ever asked me that question. Why on earth are you asking that? I said, this is a reporting exercise, right? He said, yes. I said, the only reason to write a business report is to answer a question. If you don't have a question to answer, don't waste your time writing the report. And you sure as hell shouldn't waste your staff time reviewing it. Oh, I never thought of it that way. Okay. Did you guys figure out the process you were trying to evaluate? No, what do you mean? Well, look, business is pretty basic. It's about moving a ball from A to B to do something, right?
Yep.
If you don't know what that process looks like, how are you going to evaluate it? You don't even know what data you need to collect to be able to do it. And that's actually where you start. I said, so where did you guys start this? And he goes, well, the PhD econometricians that we've got working on this thing said we needed to get all the data for the entire company together, cleaned up and put in one spot. Said, no, you need all the data that's required to answer those questions cleaned up and put in one spot.
Right.
Oh, okay. Well, did you figure out the metrics that you wanted to look at? No. What do you mean? Look, in that pipeline that goes from A to B, there's fundamentally only 3 types of metrics. How much, how fast, and how efficiently did you move the ball down the line? Everything else is a derivation on those 3 themes. Oh, never thought of it this way. This went on for an hour and a half with no. And at the end of it, I really couldn't resist. Said, so let me get this straight. You guys fired a $2 million cruise missile. Nobody ever bothered to define the target. And now you're wondering why you didn't hit it? And he kind of looked back at me and goes, when you put it that way, right? You have to hit him right between the eyes because nothing else works.
Right.
We're all working our way through this as best we can. And the solution is really very simple. It's basic blocking and tackling. This isn't rocket science.
Right. Speaking of simple, one of the things I know you're a big believer in is the idea of checklists, right? And again, that's sort of a statement of the obvious, but just because it's, as they say, conventional wisdom is generally not very conventional. So talk to me a little bit about the idea of the checklist, right? There's, it's had a resurgence in popular culture, it feels like, from Atul Gawande's book around the checklist manifesto, and its application. He's coming from a healthcare perspective mostly, but obviously it has much broader applications. And, to your point around the idea of why checklist, if you wonder if checklists work, right, and you go to hospitals and you wonder why they ask you 1,000 times, what's your name? What are you here for? Right. And the reason is because people have the wrong patient when people have had surgeries and procedures because they have the wrong person. Right. I mean,
or the wrong knee.
Yeah. The wrong knee. That's why they draw a big, cut here on your arm. It seems like silly kinds of stuff, but these are the ways you prevent, egregious errors, or all those signs up that say, wash your hands, like it feels crazy to have to tell a doctor to wash his hands in, 150 years after germ theory was invented, but here we are. Right. So, talk to us about this concept, and why we should pay as much attention to this as you think we should.
Because we have this autopilot that we didn't realize that we had. That our knee-jerk response will be to overly summarize and simplify the story. That we'll forget all the details that we need. I mean, I love Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, and I love the fact that he focused very heavily on a lot of different disciplines other than healthcare. He was
He
talking about
did. Yeah. I mean, that's where he was coming from. But yeah,
remediation.
he figured out quickly
Right.
that this has applications all over the place, right?
Exactly. And the research is uniform. The simple introduction of a checklist reduces errors by about 50%. That's a pretty cheap solution to get you a long way towards home, right?
For sure.
If I can knock off 50% of my big mistakes by asking some simple questions, man, I'm going to do it.
Yeah. And you have the chance back to that, of repeat quality too, right? So in our world, a run book, right? The reason you have run books is for this reason, right? Is if you have to have somebody do the work and they're like, I'm not 100% sure I do. You go, that's okay. Just do the steps. Right? Don't think it can only hurt the ball club, one of those kind of old things, right? Just follow the steps.
I grew up in Huntington Beach, California, which most people wouldn't know. I mean, you may have heard of it as Surf City, but Huntington Beach in the 60s was the bedroom community for the Apollo project, or for a big chunk of it. The third stage of the Saturn V was built about 3 miles from my house. The second stage was built about 5 miles, and the command module was built about 10 miles away. So half the dads on our street were Apollo engineers.
Right.
On one of those 3 plants.
Literally rocket scientists.
Literally rocket scientists, right?
Right.
A guy that was the uncle of one of my fraternity brothers was the guy who in his 20s I can't remember which year it was, 62 or 63. He was tasked with putting together the mission schedule for Apollo 11. And if you adjust for the fact that they had to move their landing site by 200 miles because there was a hurricane, a typhoon in the area, he was off by 3 seconds at splashdown.
Pretty good. Yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah.
Right?
Pretty
Not
good.
bad.
Yeah.
You got to have some respect for that. So these guys were all checklist fanatics. There's this incredibly famous picture that almost everybody's seen of Buzz Aldrin on the moon, where he's holding his left arm up at a weird angle. You know what he's doing?
He's looking at his checklist.
He's looking at his checklist. And what a lot of people don't know too is that I know a little bit more about this. My uncle was a very good friend of Buzz Aldrin's. Anyhow, Buzz was a PhD from MIT. He was the guy that figured out how to rendezvous in space. So out of 500,000 really, really bright people working for NASA, he's the one that figures out how to rendezvous. His nickname was Dr. Rendezvous. The thing that has always just kind of haunted me, if a guy like that needs a checklist, what's that say about the rest of us mortals?
Right. Those are regular intelligence, right? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so in the context of project management, I mean, there's a million project management software suites, right? There's arguments about, how best to structure those things, right? Whether you want to do Gantt charts or whether you want to do, something more simple. I get the sense that we've probably in your mind, we've overcomplicated the problem and in the process obscured what we're really shooting for there with some of that. I guess I'm just curious in terms of the tool side of it, how you think about that in the engagements you've been involved in.
Candidly, I don't much care how you run the project. All I really care about is whether or not you figured out what you need to build. I worked my way through college doing commercial construction. And in fairly short order, I started bidding jobs. And everything that's done was done off of a blueprint. Very much, and when you know exactly what it is that you need to build, pretty easy to figure out what is going to be required to do it.
Right.
I keep going back to this phrase. We've said it. It's not rocket science. If you understand what you need to do, the rest is relatively easy.
Okay, so I want to push back on that a little bit because one of the things that's clear from the projects I've been involved in is what people think they want in the beginning changes as time goes on and they begin to see iterations, particularly in the software world. This is where I was getting to with the hardware versus software thing, right? Where because it's malleable, because it's soft, right? You can change it. And therefore, I've heard myself say this before to developers, I don't know exactly what I want. Build this first version and then we'll see. And that'll help me figure it out, right? Now that's different, maybe a different question than what you're getting people to think about. So talk to me about that tension a little bit in the nature of these projects.
Okay, so I would say the very first thing, and it's the unspoken question in this dialogue, is there's a profound difference between the way you run a project and the way you come to understand what a business needs, right? Two separate things.
For sure. Yeah, there's strategy and tactics, if you will, kind of. There's a little bit of distinction there. Yeah.
We've tended to confuse those. We've tended to assume that one is the other, and it's not. They're two completely different things, two completely different skill sets, right? So
Yes.
I think that's the very first thing. I have occasionally been accused early on in the conversation of wishing to go back to waterfall. I don't feel like that at all. I have no interest in a waterfall methodology because I don't really think it works because for the very reasons that you just described, I think it's impossible.
Right.
I also don't believe that people who take Agile to the extreme, where I have heard countless people say, we're Agile, we don't have to plan. We just make it up as we go along.
Right.
And it's interesting how now a number of the fathers of the Agile Manifesto and the guys that were early on with Lean and XP and things like this, and the Scrum Alliance have come back and said, we've taken this way too far.
Yeah, you still have to have an object to the exercise, right?
You have to figure out what you're trying to build. So I would say the best way to do it, in my personal experience, is kind of a fourfold step. In companies like Nestle have done it, Chubb Insurance I know has done it, Jet Propulsion Lab has done it, where you kind of take this fourfold approach. And step one is just a pure business assessment. What is it that we're trying to do from a business perspective? What's it look like? And you get a team of everybody around. So you get the business sponsor, you get the business analyst, you get the project lead, you get the tech lead, at least those four roles looking at this and figuring out what's going to be required to do this thing. The second thing you do is plan it, but planning in the way that Flyvbjerg talks about planning, not the way that PMI's methodology, the PMBOK talks about planning, right? Coming up with the prototypes, storyboards, process maps, and prototypes. When you do that, you can still get a pretty good imagery of what it is that you want to do. I will tend to overkill that a little bit because when I try and follow this four-step approach, assess, plan, build, refine, when I build my first shot or when I'm going for my first iteration, I want a pretty good MVP. I don't expect it to be perfect. I know it's not going to be. I know I'm going to come up with other stuff, but I want it sufficiently roughed in. And from a contractor's perspective, that's really the best. It's rough carpentry.
Right.
I want it blocked out enough that I can get a pretty good idea what it's going to look like. 20 years ago, I was introduced to this style of storyboarding that I've fallen in love with immediately. And the guy was a documentary filmmaker who had turned to software development. And he was showing me an application he was developing for Genentech. And he laid this out just like you would do a storyboard in a movie.
Right.
So you could see the entire flow of it. And his two parts were, here's the process map, here's the workflow. Now, these are what the screens look like. They didn't have everything, but they had it enough. Because after you've got that next wave in there, then you can build it very quickly.
Right.
Right? Then you can build it very quickly. Flyvbjerg has got a line that has cracked me up. And there's two that I think are particularly funny is think slow, act fast. So take your time to think it through, ask all the questions that need to be asked. Don't act as if that's not work, because it is.
Right.
A lot of people have this thing that, well, I want to get busy. You are getting busy, right? You actually are developing a product here. It's just cheaper to do it this way.
Yes.
The way that he says that, the reason he says to do that is, think of it this way. When you start executing, when you actually bring in all the developers and the coders and the testers and all the rest of the stuff, said, that's like opening the window of a house. Said, the longer the window's open, the more flies are going to come in. The more weird stuff just happens, right? People get sick, or, somebody quits, or
right.
You want to execute as fast as you can possibly execute, close it off and say, okay, next, how would we like to change this? And, I'm a big fan of that approach. And, going back to NASA and Buzz Aldrin, people forget the fact that the moonshot was the first agile development methodology.
It's true.
Right? I mean, anybody who's followed that at all, when Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon, we had a grand total of 15 minutes of spaceflight experience. right? And NASA had to figure out, my God, what do we, and we hadn't even orbited.
Yeah, they barely fired anybody into the upper stratosphere, much less free floating. You know,
We had shot Alan Shepard up 260 miles in the air, and he came up down 260 miles downrange.
yeah,
So NASA had to figure out, okay, well, we got to get into orbit. We got to be able to drop out of orbit. The whole movie Hidden Figures was, how do you drop out of orbit where you need to drop out of orbit, right? The whole movie was about that. Then we got to keep guys alive for 2 weeks. We got to keep 3 guys alive in a spacecraft for 2 weeks. We got to leave low Earth orbit. We got to be able to dock, undock, rendezvous. We had to do all of this stuff. And we knocked them down one at a time. They knocked down each step in succession. And when they got that right, they moved to the next step. So it does work. One last thought real fast.
Yeah.
The challenge that people forget about is that there are some disciplines that are worth preserving. And several of the fathers of the Agile Manifesto have made the observation that when programming developed in the 60s and 70s, it was surprising that the demographic makeup was everything from about 20 to 60 in terms of age range. And there were an enormous number of females that were in that space. Nowadays, you've got most developers are sub 25, they're male, and they've only been in that discipline, they've only been in that career for about the last 2 years.
Right.
And this is not my observations. Again, these are guys that were signers of the Agile Manifesto. The one thing that we know, having been sub 25-year-old males, we're not particularly good at foresight or planning.
Right.
We tend to not to like to do that. It's just not our forte.
No, we're much more ready, ready, fire, aim.
Which is why they draft us to go off to war.
Yeah.
Right? Our brains haven't sort of solidified yet. I'm not dismissing the age band in any way, shape, or form, but we have tended to get ageist in our society at a time when some of those are functional attributes that are worthwhile preserving.
Yeah, and that sort of cross-disciplinary experience, right, pays off. I mean, it's why, sometimes getting someone from outside of your particular industry can generate really enlightening insights, right? That sort of, hey, let me ask you a dumb question. Why do you guys do that? Oftentimes leads to, I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe we shouldn't do that. That, or if I can't explain it, it doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but we probably ought to figure out why we're doing it. Back to the point of that iterative cycle of constantly reassessing the whys. So
I mentioned that I had spent some time working with a venture fund that was just doing SaaS software, and I've pitched over multiple businesses to Sand Hill Road. So for those who aren't familiar with Sand Hill Road, it's Mecca for venture capital in Silicon Valley.
Yep.
So all of I've hit all of the large firms, Andreessen Horowitz, Kleiner Perkins, Summit, just US Ventures. I mean, it kind of goes down the list. I have to admit, when I was a young entrepreneur, nothing would incense me more than listening to a VC who had never operated a business in an entire life make the statement, oh, that won't work. How on earth do you know it won't work? And it was only when I was working for this other venture fund, working with them, that I was talking to one of the partners who had also had that experience as an entrepreneur previously. And he opened my eyes to something I hadn't thought about before. He said, it's pattern recognition. He said, in their role, they're talking to 30 companies a day, all in the same space. And they're not articulating for you why they know it won't work, but all of these companies are telling us we tried that and that didn't work, and here's why. So you're getting the truncated version of that response. So for all of you wannabe entrepreneurs out there that are trying to raise money from a venture capitalist, remember the fact that they're not necessarily being arrogant. They're seeing things that you don't.
No, and they're looking for a specific type of work, right? Success. The definition of work means something. It means something very specific in that range, right? Generally means, extremely rapid growth, right, with an ability to scale around it. Because there are lots of successful businesses that don't fit that model. And generally an entrepreneur, back to the point we were talking to earlier, is in love with their idea, right? They want it to be a huge success. But even if it's a partial success, they'd still take that most often, right? They wouldn't discard it. Whereas a VC would say, no, we're looking for 10 baggers, right? We don't bet on singles, right? Great. You built a nice little business. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the game they play. Right. So I think that gets lost a lot in that discussion for sure.
I think it does too.
When you talk to clients and when they think about these projects, what are they worrying about most, and are they worrying about the right things? And I know we've talked some about them missing, but like when they think about the things they worry about, where are they maybe going wrong, and where are they going right, if you will, in terms of the things that they're worrying about?
They're worrying about the wrong things. More often than not, they're not looking at where the real problem is. There's a logic. It's not logical. There is a knee-jerk response. Let me back up for a second. In all of human experience, when somebody doesn't do what we think they ought to do, or they don't do something we think they should, we tend to ascribe malice. We do this in our relationships with our spouses. We do it with our kids. We do it with our coworkers. We do it with our neighbors, right?
Right.
It is our knee-jerk default response. It is invariably wrong, right? You cannot assume malice where none is intended. So the very first thing that they're doing is something is not going right. They're assuming malice. Or malice or incompetence. There's something wrong with the people doing this.
Right. It's a people problem.
It's a people problem. It's not a people problem. Well, it's not the people problem that you think it is.
Right.
We lay into the people that we don't think are doing the right job, and we call them every name in the book. We make these people work ungodly hours to the point where they burn out. I mean, how many times have you heard stories of people working, 24 hours, days on?
Yeah, that's guaranteeing. You're guaranteeing your error rate's going way up, right? I mean, doesn't take an operations, professional to figure that out.
So my point in bringing this up is the way we are running projects right now is immoral. It's unethical, and it's immoral, and it's stupid, and it's a waste of time. We have got to put guardrails around a communication process that nobody can control. And unless we wake up to that reality, unless we embrace the fact that we don't control our communication the way we thought we did, we are going to be perpetually damned to repeat these mistakes. But if we do appreciate the fact that simple things like putting in a checklist, simple things like reframing the argument, it's not an IT project, it's a business project that just happens to be enabled by technology.
Right.
Yeah, the scales kind of drop from their eyes at those points, right? I was telling you the story about the CEO, the guy was stunned when I said, it's a reporting project, right? The only reason you write a report is to answer a question.
What are the reports supposed to tell you? What problem are they supposed to help you solve, right? Or give you some enlightenment on,
Not rocket science, but we're not teaching this in our universities. We don't teach it from a business perspective, and we don't teach it from a technical perspective.
Right.
So nobody's getting trained on this stuff. So to finally answer your question, they're looking in the wrong place. They know it's a people issue, but they're looking at the wrong people issue, which means they can't solve it because they keep doing more of the same, expecting different results.
Right.
Which never works. You just dig yourself in a deeper hole. Like so many things in life, sometimes it's just a whole lot easier to take a step back, take 2 steps to the side. How long do we run our head into a wall before we realize the door's 3 feet to the left?
Right. We're missing. Yeah, we're missing.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. So that's a lot less painful to do it that way. And I think that's what we need to do. And I think that's what the executives need to become increasingly aware of. So,
that's not the most optimistic viewpoint on things given the state of current affairs. So as you look ahead, 2-3 years, what gives you optimism? What do you feel good about as you think about the state of play in this particular area?
I know we can do it. I know we can do it. I know we can achieve incredible things when we get out of our own way. It's when we sit in our own little corners or retreat to our own corners and say, it's got to be my way or it's nothing, right? It's when we get past that and realize, hey, for God's sake, we can work together on this and we can actually achieve something. When our backs are up, when America's back is against the wall, we do some pretty great things. I don't know if you've ever heard of the book, The Fourth Turning.
Yes.
Yeah, so it got a lot of notoriety when Trump was elected because some of his advisors were big aficionados of the book.
Yeah.
But the press generally did a really poor job of explaining what the book was all about.
Yeah.
It was misrepresented kind of horribly, and the idea that it was I don't know how to describe it. The idea that it was the driving force behind Donald Trump, I always thought was ridiculous. But
that was a gross oversimplification, for sure.
Gross oversimplification. But the basic idea of the book is that society follows cycles, much like the seasons of a long human life. The cycles run 80 to 100 years, and you have a great high, which always immediately follows a crisis. That goes on for 20 to 25 years, and you have what they described as an awakening, and then an unraveling, and then a crisis. And we're in the crisis now, right? Where the pendulum has swung so far back to the other direction. It's the complete antithesis of John Kennedy saying, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. We couldn't be any more diametrically opposed to that, right? It's all about me. Their whole premise is that America will reach a point where there is some horrible crisis, that we will either all hang separately or we will hang together. And when that finally comes, when that moment of existential crisis hits, the more sober voices in the group will rise up and say, enough of this crap. We're not going to keep fighting each other. And in some ways, I think that's beginning to happen. I can't guarantee it, so I'm hopeful that that's beginning to happen.
Right.
I take solace in the fact that after Pearl Harbor, within weeks, the government went to places like Ford and General Motors and Chrysler and said, you don't make cars anymore. You make B-29s. And within 6 months, Ford was rolling out one B-29 an hour. America can do some stuff when we choose to put our minds to it. There was another great, I don't want to be so long-winded, I'm sorry, Brian. There's a Wall Street Journal ran an article 20 or so years ago. And the first article was what a horrible mistake America had made in their complacency, allowing the Asian companies to develop HD TV. So we've lost this market for all time. 10 months later, or 11 months later, they wrote another article, which was basically, boy, were we wrong. So a couple of engineers saw that article, got pissed off, realized that the way that Sony and Samsung had figured out HD TV was all analog. They came up with another solution that was all digital, got that patented. It was a much better, much cheaper protocol to do in the first place. And within 9 months, they were licensing the manufacturing of the HD TVs that were all digital to Sony and Samsung, and the pendulum had completely swung.
Right.
When we get out of our own way, we can do a lot.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. On that note, I always like to wrap up with something personal. So you sound like a guy that reads and thinks about things fairly widely. So could you share something with us that you've watched or read lately that you think others ought to check out?
Well, I'd almost end where I began in this domain. I would tell them to read Ben Flybridge's book.
And we're gonna get that in the show notes. You've had a couple of references throughout. We'll get those in the show notes for sure.
I'd really recommend that one. If nothing else, Daniel Kahneman wrote Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah, great book.
Highly, highly recommend that book. Robert Sapolsky's Behave is another outstanding book that I would suggest that they go through. A little bit longer, a little bit harder to wade into, but really worthwhile. Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would say those would be it.
All right. Well, Dave, with that, we'll let you get back to it. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure. Enjoyed talking with you. And as always, we appreciate you coming on Cut the Shit.
No, thanks for having me. And again, I love the title of the podcast.
Great. Have a good day. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, we'd appreciate it if you would become a subscriber wherever you get your podcasts. And if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that would really help us out. Or you can just go old school and tell your friends, your family, your colleagues, and hell, anybody else who you think might want to hear something like this to listen in. If you're on social media, make sure to follow us on TikTok at CutTheShitPod, all one word, where we post lots of clips from the podcast. And last but not least, you can also watch the YouTube version of the show on our YouTube channel at Plow Networks. Until next time, take care and have a great day.